What I'm going to do next for the next 8 minutes, as slowly as I can manage, is talk to you about I told you about the refugee legal and social service that I created in Brussels on the basis of all the other stuff I've been talking about. So, I'm starting now. After a number of years of heading up this group which looked after refugees, we became rather more cognizant of the problems which were inherently linked to migration and asylum and displaced persons in general. It became very clear to us during those 6 or 7 years before 1997 that if you're working in a charitable sector, you're used to people having problems. Obviously, that's why you're a charity. People who are hungry or people who are thirsty, haven't got any clothes, they haven't got anywhere to live, they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their utility bills, that sort of thing. They can't pay for healthcare, for example. Now, that in a Western society, as you all know, because you're all raised, I think, in Western societies, is an aberration. Now we have welfare states and social services and free hospitals, free at the point of delivery. All these things really have been consigned to the past. These problems shouldn't really exist anymore for nationals of Western European states. But it became very clear to me in those years of having experience of asylum seekers and migrants that was in fact the norm for these people. Now, I don't like saying these people because they're people, basically, just people. But if you imagine the late 17th century or the early 18th century in any Western European country, this was before the safety net of social services had been created. There was no welfare state. There was no concept of the state looking after the poor. They had to sort themselves out or die, basically. And throughout human history, that was more or less the case. It's only, I'd say, from the 1830s or 40s onwards that movements in Western Europe, mostly Christian-based movements, had the concept of creating a safety net through which people could not fall, which would mean people would not die of hunger anymore or cold in the streets. Everyone would have housing, everybody would have healthcare. These things had been consigned to 200 or 300 years ago. Now, interestingly enough, that was the period during which St. Vincent de Paul, who was a French priest, was active. And this was back in the mid-18th century, where, of course, there was no provision to look after the poor. And so he would find babies being left on his doorstep in the morning. The mothers couldn't afford to feed, that sort of thing. And so he'd take them in. And it's very interesting because he started by trying to create a charity that would try and make up for the gaps that the state was leaving. People who were dying of preventable disease and malnutrition and hypothermia. It shouldn't happen. It still happens now. It shouldn't happen at any time. And he called upon well-to-do ladies, who he called the dames de la charité, the ladies of charity. And these well-to-do ladies were very rich, and they came from rich, high society families. But the problem was they had plenty of time on their hands and they had money. But these ladies didn't like all the shit and the dirt and the nastiness involved in poverty, because poverty is a nasty thing. And so while they had lots of goodwill, they couldn't cope with the down and dirty nature of the work, to use an Americanism. So what he did then was he changed his idea, and he then called upon servant girls. And he created the group called les filles de la charité, the daughters of charity. And these were servant girls who were used to emptying chamber pots and picking up the shit and the piss and the rest of it. So they weren't disgusted by poverty. And they were very good at going out and helping people who had bed sores, who were badly maintained, who were dirty, who were smelly, who were aggressive. And that was how it all started. So to come back again to what I was saying at the beginning of my speech, 6 or 7 years of experience with refugees and asylum seekers, it became clear that on the one hand they were people who had needs like every other person. On the other hand, they were legal cases. So each and every foreigner abroad is a legal problem waiting to happen, as it were. And many of you are not Belgian nationals, so you've probably been through the mill of having to find documentation and getting the right seals and the stamps and the translated documents and that sort of thing to become regularised or legal. Now, none of these poor refugees could attain to that status. So we had to have a skill set on the social side to feed and house, but also on the legal side to try and help these people to see their way through the thickets of the Belgian administration. And I should point out now, as an aside, of which I do many, that Western European governments have found a reasonably good and cost-effective solution to getting rid of asylum seekers. Basically, they ignore them and hope they'll go away. And so if you're an asylum seeker or just a migrant in Belgium with no money and no means of support, you will either die or work illegally or end up going home. So the governments hope that these people will take the hint and just go home. But we felt that that's unacceptable in a civilized society. So we set up the social service and the legal service. And in the legal service we had a couple of lawyers, avocats, and a couple of jurists, so juriste in French. There's a difference between the French terminology and the English terminology here. And so the first thing you do when a migrant comes to you and says, I need help, my life is all screwed up, do something for me, you have to work out what their status is. Have they availed themselves of all the legal instruments that the Belgian state has created to try and regularize their situation and become, rather than undocumented migrants, documented migrants? That's what the French call sans-papiers. It's what the English call undocumented migrants. So they're foreigners with no documents to justify their existence. It's maybe a sad commentary on the way we create our societies that you have to have documents to justify your existence. In our charity, we felt that the simple fact of being a human being was enough justification. But that isn't the way the governments look at these things. So we did a lot of work helping the asylum seekers to be able to avail themselves of their rights. Another problem we noticed was that a lot of asylum seekers, when they come into the country and want obviously to get a status, they will go to a lawyer. Now, not all lawyers are competent, and not all lawyers, sad to say, are filled with goodwill and altruism. So a lot of lawyers would actually do the bare minimum, charge a lot of money, and then just drop the case. And that meant people would come to us once it was too late, because they'd already had a bad lawyer who'd screwed up, basically, their situation. And it's much harder to undo a screwed up legal situation than to start one up from scratch. It's rather like trying to redo a bad translation. It's easier to start from scratch. So we spend a lot of time, and still do in fact, trying to undo the errors or the results of laziness on the part of lawyers, who are either incompetent or lazy. They're not all that way. And I would point out that Shakespeare in Henry IV does say, kill all the lawyers. So maybe he's right along those lines. Anyway, so we've done both these things, and we've acquired a great deal of expertise. For example, one thing we're particularly proud of is that in our legal service, we were the first people in Belgium to have the fear of female circumcision accepted as a motive for asylum. Now imagine that you are living in Liberia, for example, or Ghana, and your mother and your sister grab you when you're 8 years old and hold you down and get one of the midwives to come with a bit of dirty flint and cut off your labia. You know, that to me is a terrible thing. And if you know it's going to happen, you run away and try and get to a country where that doesn't happen, then I think that I would say more power to your elbow. And that to me is a basic human right to avoid torture of that sort. But up until, I think this was in 2002, there'd never been a case brought before the Belgian courts where the fear of female circumcision had been deemed a sufficient ground to claim asylum. And now it is. So I'm pleased that we actually were the first people to get that done. Another thing we did, which I became a bit of a specialist in, was deal with medical care for asylum seekers. Now, I was saying, wasn't I, at the beginning, that's 9 minutes, it's time to stop.
Finish your idea.
Okay, I was saying at the beginning that refugees and asylum seekers in Western Europe today are rather like everyone else was 200 years ago. There's nothing to support them, there's no safety net. They can fall and they can die. Healthcare is a particular problem because a lot of people who come from countries where there are various nasty diseases that are endemic, and they've been badly fed and badly housed for decades, and they're really, really sickly. And there was no provision in Belgium for these people who were not on the register of population to have healthcare. So we actually did a lot of lobbying through an umbrella organisation called CIRE, and this was something which I was very keen on. And we spent years doing this, and we finally managed to get the Belgian government to create a status for undocumented migrants, that is, sans-papiers, the illegals, whereby they could get urgent medical assistance, even if they had no status. So we again felt that was something worth doing, and it's been done, and it's now part of the legal landscape in this country. Have to stop, that was 10 minutes, I do apologise.